Hello and welcome to the Liverpool.com podcast. I'm James Martin, back after a short break. Caught some of the Olympics in Paris, which was very nice indeed, but pleased to be back on the Liverpool.com podcast, where today we're going to be talking about the number 6 role amid developments there, with the Athletic reporting that a mystery number 6 has been identified by the club and that Liverpool is looking to strengthen there in what remains of the transfer window. So exciting developments there. Before I dive into it with Matt Addison, who joins me today, just a quick message from our sponsors, NordVPN. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the podcast episode description box. Right, Matt, let's get down to it then. There's swirling rumours about who this number 6 could be, but it does look as though one will be targeted, which I suppose is the obvious place to start. There was sort of some umming and ahhing about Liverpool, whether they'd even want to go into the market in that position. I know we've talked about the possibility of McAllister maintaining that role a lot. Are you surprised that Liverpool have decided, after sort of assessing the squad a little bit, that that's a position where they want to recruit?
Not particularly. I suppose the first thing to say is that I don't think it was ever the case that Liverpool weren't looking in that department. Obviously, they look in every single position all of the time and have a list of 4 or 5 players that if they needed to, they could go into the market for. But I think the number 6, the holding midfield position, is one that most people have identified as somewhere that Liverpool would like to strengthen. They've obviously had a look at a couple of options in the past couple of summers, so it's clearly something that they've thought as well is something that they need to sort out for the long term. The question really was just, is there someone on the market that's a substantial improvement on what they already had? I think it seems to be the case that maybe there's 1 or 2 options out there that they think that is the case for. If they can get that over the line, I think that makes sense. I think there's still obviously, huge hopes for Stefan Bajcetic and 1 or 2 others. Trainer Ione has obviously impressed a lot during pre-season, but those players are so young and so inexperienced, possibly, that you need, somebody else to be in there in the meantime, and you can clearly never have too many good players. So it's not a surprise to me that they're looking at that position. It's just a case of, who is that player? And I think we've said that a few times, to be fair, across the last few months. I don't think it was a case of Liverpool don't need an elite number 6. The question was, is there one out there that they can go and get? It seems that possibly the answer might be yes, although there is, a little bit of a race against time to get something done before the end of the transfer window. I'm sure there won't be any panic if it doesn't happen, but from the sounds of the reporting around it seems to be that there might be someone that they think fits the bill.
Yeah, it's quite a nice position for Slot to be in a way. It's signing from a position of strength that maybe Liverpool wasn't quite in last summer, in the sense that Wataru Endo's come in and done a good job. We know that he can play there. Alexis McAllister has maybe surprised us all with how well he did in that deep role. And, you've been one of the big advocates for keeping him there. Certainly there's a case to be made for that. And of course, as you mentioned, Bajcetic coming through. So it's not one where Liverpool can sort of be held to ransom for their top targets. And as you say, if they don't get anyone, it probably wouldn't be a disaster, although of course there comes a point where a signing does have to be made. Liverpool can't wait for the perfect market conditions every year, so it's interesting to assess who's out there. And as you say, maybe this is the summer where they feel there's some value to be found in one place or another. One potential sort of avenue, if you like, and maybe the one that most people seem to think is most likely in terms of this kind of mystery target, if you want, is Varela from Porto. So we'll talk about him first. How much do you know about him, and what do you make of his name being a prominent one to emerge?
Yeah, I mean, he's been linked with Liverpool a few times. I think of the players that we're going to talk about, he's probably the one that I know the least about. But there are still things that, you can have a look at and see within his profile. Really very good at passing. And I think that is going to be a theme of what we talk about, really, is that it's got to be somebody who is absolutely elite on the ball. Obviously, that's what McAllister brought to that role last season. It's something that we saw Wataru Endo struggle with in the first pre-season friendly, then dropped out of the team for the following 2. Obviously, you don't want to overread into these things, but I would suggest that that's possibly, one of the reasons that Liverpool want to find an improvement in that department, that maybe Endo isn't on the ball as good as what he needs to be for being a long-term solution. Obviously, the age of the player and the fact that he was a relatively short-term option when Liverpool bought him last summer for a relatively modest fee. I think that certainly is something that would be a big tick in Varela's box. I haven't seen loads of him, but Liverpool have obviously shopped in the Portuguese market a number of times. You know, Michael Edwards and Julian Ward have shopped there. They have particular expertise in that kind of area. If it was to be him, that wouldn't be a huge shock, given he's been linked to Liverpool before. Obviously, we're just kind of guessing and having a look at the moment. But there are some big boxes. I think the passing is one of them. I think it's got to be a young player with a much higher ceiling. The suggestion from people who've watched Porto a lot more than I have seemed to be that, you know, he could go on and be a very, very good player in the future. Obviously, has played relatively regularly for his country as well, which is a big tick in his box. So I think there's a few things there that you'd look at. Quite the price, what Porto would want for him, I'm not quite sure whether Liverpool would be prepared to pay that much. But yeah, there's certainly, from what I know of him, there's certainly reasons to think that he could be, you know, a potential option on this shortlist. But as I say, I know probably more about the other players than about him.
Don't worry, we'll reach the other players shortly. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and possibly one where it kind of gives an insight, if you like, into the kind of gap between what we can do as sort of fans looking at new signings and what the club has access to. Because, you know, as you say, when a new player gets linked, all we can do is sort of watch clips, do a bit of research into the numbers. And as you say, what stands out is, you know, his huge passing volume and progressive passing volume at that, which is obviously encouraging. But then there's the interesting point to make that he's obviously been doing it in a Porto team that's very dominant. There's, you know, 3 giants in the Portuguese league, and outside of those fixtures, they're expected to pretty much dominate against everyone else, which of course is going to provide useful context for those passing numbers. At the same time, it probably provides context for maybe slightly underwhelming defensive numbers. If you just sort of take a quick look at his stats, you think, oh dear, does Liverpool really want this number 6 who's sort of maybe not tackling it in a particularly high volume, not making that many interceptions? But then, of course, you have to raise the point of how much is he going to be needing to do that in a team which is, you know, dominant on the ball, is enjoying the vast share of attacks. So, you know, these are all of the questions which it's hard to answer with the sort of publicly available numbers, but the club will have done far more due diligence than anyone else. They will have access to these analytics, and of course these analytical minds who sort of far outweigh anything that we can do on this podcast or anywhere else in terms of the media. So yeah, I mean, it's one of them where you look at the track record of the likes of Michael Edwards and the people he's brought into this recruitment team, and you think, if they think he's the one, then you probably have to give that degree of trust. But I think you're right to say that he's maybe one who's less familiar to a lot of fans over here. So one to watch, but yeah, maybe not one that we can get too excited about until we see what he would bring in person. So we'll have a look at a couple of the other names. But just quickly before we move on, I suppose, with that sort of point we've been talking about on passing, do you think that is kind of our first, or at least one of the early hints that there's going to be a bit of a shift in focus, change in style under Arne Slot? Or do you think if we'd been out in the market to sign an elite number 6 under Klopp, it would also have been one where there would have been a big focus on that kind of passing possession part of the game?
Yeah, I mean, it's important, isn't it? But I think there is definitely a change of style. I think we've seen that within the makeup of the midfield. Obviously, we'll see that even more when Alexis McAllister starts to play matches again. He's obviously not featured in pre-season games, at least so far, for Liverpool this summer. So I think it will be interesting to see what happens. I think it's not a 4-2-3-1, as Arne Slot has very clearly stated, but it's not a million miles away from that, and it's certainly closer to that than the 4-3-3 that we saw with Jurgen Klopp in the last couple of seasons. So I think there is going to be a bit of a change of style. It's very much more patient. I think Curtis Jones put it quite well when he was talking about how it's very possession dominant. It's much slower and much more patient in terms of the build-up going through the thirds. It's a lot less direct. And obviously, there's lots of players who can progress the ball in this Liverpool team, McAllister being one. Obviously, Trent can do it from fullback. There's, you know, Virgil van Dijk can do it. There's, you know, even the goalkeepers can do it to some extent as well. There's players all over the pitch. That was actually something that Pep Lijnders was always talking about really at every opportunity, was that every player on the pitch, goalkeeper included, was capable of playing that final pass. I think it's going to be a little bit more, I suppose, more passing dominated, a bit more Pep Guardiola-like in terms of the way that Liverpool build up and play. And obviously to have that, you're probably going to have somebody who can maybe drop in between the two centre-backs and pick the ball up and receive the ball on the edge of his own penalty area on the half turn and be able to do that. I think, interestingly, Romeo Lavia potentially, although we haven't seen him a great deal for Chelsea so far, obviously he was one that Liverpool looked at last summer. I think he possibly could have been someone who could be developed into a player like that. Again, obviously very, very young and hasn't got a great long list of seasons where he's been able to do that. So I'm not saying for definite that there's a complete change of style, or that, if Liverpool had got Lavia, then maybe Klopp could have done something similar. But I do think there will be, a definitive change in the way that Liverpool look. And there will be a couple of times, I think, in the first month or two where it goes wrong. We saw, a couple of mistakes that maybe weren't punished, particularly in the Manchester United game over in the US, where I think Canate gave it away 2 or 3 times. There was 1 or 2 other mistakes as well. I think that will be something to watch out for Liverpool, and they may have to just ride the luck a couple of times and get away with those. But I think it's definitely something that we're going to see them working towards. They've done it so far, but I think as soon as we see, probably on Sunday against Sevilla or Las Palmas, depending on which match Alexis McAllister plays in, I think once you put him into the team, we'll really start to get a feel of what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, Romeo Lavia has been doing well by all accounts in pre-season, having had some injury woes for Chelsea in that first campaign. So it's an interesting one in terms of what could have been. But I think you're right to say that it's probably a mixture of kind of the way the game is going anyway, and the specific demands of the Arne Slot system in terms of what Liverpool is looking for in that holding midfield role. So an interesting one in terms of who gets targeted. I suppose, having spoken about that, the obvious next player to go to might be Manuel Ugarte, who's been at PSG, because I suppose the one question mark over him is whether he fits into that mould. He seems, on paper at least, as more of a kind of destroyer, more like if Liverpool were trying to directly replace Fabinho. His passing volume is good and very reliable in terms of the percentage that he gets off, but he's not much of a progressor, is he, compared to someone like a Varela?
Yeah, I think that is the key difference. It reminds me a little bit of João Palhinha, who people were very, very keen for Liverpool to be in for. But I think the João Palhinha that we see at Fulham is not necessarily going to be the same one that we see for Bayern Munich, where it's a completely different role. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be as perfect a fit as what some people think. So I think that's a big consideration, and it goes back to that style, really. I think it's fair to say that Ugarte is very much a tackling monster. He covers a lot of ground. He does a lot of the things that Fabinho does, but I think an underrated part of Fabinho's game really was that passing ability. There was a lot of assists that he got from the base of that midfield, where he was just able to step forward and then loft the ball over the top into one of the forwards. I don't think you'd necessarily see that from a Ugarte, a Palhinha. A player like that, I think, is a bit more destructive. Maybe it would have been more suitable for a Jurgen Klopp team. Even then, though, I think if Liverpool really wanted to go and get Ugarte last summer when he went to PSG, they probably could have got involved in that conversation and clearly didn't. They didn't go for anyone until they went big for Moises Caicedo, when it looked like he might be a possibility. So I think with all of these players, I know obviously Edwards and Julian Ward are back, and there's a different sporting director now at Liverpool, but there's a large number of players that I think if Liverpool thought that they were good enough to improve that holding midfield, they probably would have bought them last summer. I think he probably fits into that category for me. There was a clear need for them to get a number 6 last summer. They did do it in terms of Wataru Endo, but they didn't go big and spend a substantial amount on one in the end. So he kind of, to me, if Liverpool were really desperate to buy him, they probably would have done it already. And I suppose it's also worth mentioning with him that it looks like the deal for him to go to Manchester United this summer obviously hasn't worked for him at PSG, but it doesn't look like he's going to go to Manchester United either. So you'd have to question, A, if they're in for him, then is that a transfer policy that you want to be copying? And B, if it's not happening, then how much must the transfer fee or the wages or whatever else be in terms of that deal. So yeah, there's a couple of red flags. I think with him, I think it would be pretty unlikely for it to be him that ends up at Liverpool.
Yeah, I suppose the Man United links do kind of signpost his availability this summer in theory, that PSG are open to a deal at the right price. But yeah, if Man United are balking at that price or the wages or whatever it may be, then you're certainly correct to point out that would almost definitely be kind of a dead in the water deal for Liverpool, given that it's historically more conservative in the wages it pays out, in the transfer fees it pays out, except when we're dealing with real top targets who it's identified as game changers. And as you say, if Ugarte did fit in that mould, it would be surprising if we hadn't seen a move for him already. But I suppose as the window progresses, if a couple of other targets come to nothing, we could see his name come up again. It depends how desperate Liverpool and Slot are for this new number 6. Like we said at the top of the show, you'd hope and imagine that there isn't that desperation there because of the options already in the squad. So yeah, maybe the least likely of the ones we'll discuss, but good to sort of touch on a name that's been doing the rounds, especially with that Man United deal seemingly not coming to fruition. But the other name which I've seen mentioned a lot is Martin Zubimendi, who I've spoken about quite a bit before he's really been linked, because I do quite like the look of him, and it's been surprising that he's not had that top-level move already in many ways. He's at Real Sociedad, by all accounts, enjoying life there. He said in the past that he looks at the likes of Varela as his idols rather than Real Madrid. The Spanish game have both been linked in the past, I think. So yeah, it's not one who necessarily be easy to prize out of Sociedad, but like I say, it does seem like a move at this point is to a certain extent overdue, which maybe don't want to disrespect Sociedad by saying that, but you do get that feeling. Do you think he's one who could be a good fit for Liverpool?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing to say about him is that Xabi Alonso is a big fan of him, having worked with him a little bit earlier in his career, which is probably no bad sign in terms of, Alonso is clearly a very good coach, but also was an excellent player in that kind of more passing, deep-lying playmaker type role. So I think that's probably a big thing, a big tick in his favour in terms of what I think of him. I think he's a player that would definitely be attainable, as you say. The question would be, is he willing to leave that region of Spain? The release clause, by all accounts, is about 60 million euros, so I think it's probably quite steep for him. I think you would probably try and negotiate that if it was to be him that you went for, but even that, it's not out of reach by any stretch of the imagination for Liverpool. It's just a case really of, is he at the level? I think he's 25 years of age, so like you say, he's probably at the right point in his career to move on and take that next step. There's been links with various clubs really. Manchester United, I think a few weeks ago, were linked quite heavily with him. He's been linked with Barcelona in the past as well. But yeah, it would certainly be interesting, and I think he's probably the one out of the names that we've picked. And of course, Liverpool could have a completely different target. There might be some data somewhere in Michael Edwards' laptop that's pulled up a name that no one's even heard of, and suddenly becomes in and becomes the next Fabinho or whatever it might be. But I think of the names that we've discussed, I think Zubimendi makes the most sense to me in terms of ticking the most boxes. That's not to say that he's perfect. Again, if he was, I think Liverpool possibly could have done that deal last summer and could have gone for him then. But I think in an imperfect number 6 market, he's probably, in my eyes at least, from what I've seen of him, the experience that he's got, the boxes that he ticks, I think he's probably the most logical option to go for. But we'll have to see what happens really in terms of whether it is him or someone else. But I think if I was to sit here and predict who it might be and who it might most likely be, I think that would probably be where I would put the bet in at this point.
Interesting. So if I had to pick now, I'd probably say it's likeliest to be Varela, just off a hunch really. But in terms of who I'd most like to see out of the ones we've discussed, I would probably say Zubimendi. I do really like the look of him, as I said. I suppose the one question mark you could throw at him is maybe how he would cope with that transition from La Liga to the Premier League. It's such an intense league, such a physical league. It wouldn't really be the physicality that would worry me, but maybe that kind of pace of play. You wonder if the kind of these metronomic almost players who dictate the rhythm from from the base of the midfield, whether they can sort of still do that when there's chaos all around them. But I mean, I was encouraged in that respect by when he came on in the Euros final. Actually, I thought, that's pretty much the biggest occasion you can come on in, especially replacing Rodri, who had won all of the plaudits at that tournament. People were saying how, it had cemented his status in the Ballon d'Or race, and I thought Zubimendi came on and played better, to be honest. Not to take a swing at Rodri, who's obviously, one of the best around in that position, if not the best. But yeah, I thought Spain looked, if anything, even more secure with Zubimendi in there. I thought he played an excellent game, and yeah, I suppose that sort of cemented in my mind the idea that he's ready for that move and maybe ready for that Liverpool move. I think those are the three main ones, but I suppose just because I've seen it going around on social media a little bit, I'll throw the name in there because I think it's probably a pipe dream that if it could happen, it would probably shoot straight to the top of Liverpool's list, and that's Aurelien Tchouameni. We know that Liverpool have liked him in the past, which is a theme we've touched upon with a couple of these other targets. The question, of course, is whether you can get him out of Real Madrid. I suppose the only reason to have any hope there is just how stacked that midfield department is. He played quite a lot last season, to be fair, but there's always that competition for minutes with a host of other world-class midfielders. Do you think with Kroos retiring and Modric, veteran now, do you think that Tchouameni sees this as the time when he can really stake that claim at Real Madrid, or do you think there's maybe that window where his game time still isn't quite what he wanted, and you can maybe sort of get in his ear a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth asking the question, isn't it? I think Carlo Ancelotti has spoken this week about Jude Bellingham's role not being changed despite the arrival of Kylian Mbappe. I have to say I was hoping that Bellingham might have to drop back and maybe Tchouameni wouldn't have such an easy route to minutes, but it doesn't sound like that's going to be the case. I think he would obviously be the dream option. I mentioned before that Liverpool have had their eye on this position of holding midfield for a while now. He was obviously the person I was referring to, as well as Caicedo in terms of 2022. Liverpool did look at him, but it became clear pretty quickly that he wanted to go to Real Madrid. So, yeah, he would be the dream option, certainly. Is it likely? I mean, at some point, someone big has got to leave Real Madrid because there's just far too many players there. I wondered if it might be Rodrigo this summer, who's obviously been linked with Liverpool a little bit tenuously at times as well. Vinicius, they've got so many attacking options. It's probably slightly easier now to get into that midfield. Maybe the fact that Kroos and Modric and various others have kind of moved a little bit towards the end of their careers or have retired completely, I think is probably the culmination of the plan, really. I think for Tchouameni, it was probably always the case that he knew he'd have to wait and be patient a couple of years to then get to that point where he's probably one of the first names on the team sheet for the next few years. To then leave at that point, I don't think would make a huge amount of sense for him. If he's been patient up to this point, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, then I don't necessarily think that will change this summer. But hey, it's worth asking the question, isn't it? If you're Liverpool, you would try and get that deal done. I think that would be the absolute dream option. Even then, I don't know how much it would cost to get him out of there. I think he cost about 80 million a couple of years ago, and it would be north of that. But for Liverpool, it's not about the money. They obviously put the money down for Caicedo last summer and couldn't get him. It's more about getting the right option. If they can get an elite option in, I think that would be, absolutely massive ahead of the new season.
Yeah, it's one of those where if the slightest opportunity arises, you'd imagine Liverpool would be all over it, and they do have that sort of track record of going, quite hard to try and sign him 2 years ago. But he knows that Liverpool admires him a lot and really wants him. So if he did ever feel undervalued at Real Madrid, then hopefully that's one Liverpool would be in a pretty good position to capitalise on. But yeah, as we say, very much the dream option rather than a particularly realistic one at this moment in time. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how things play out. And of course, we'll bring you all of the latest as more transfer news breaks. We'll have that for you over on Liverpool.com, where we have a transfer live blog every day, as well as plenty of news and analysis articles as well. And we'll keep you up to date here on the Liverpool.com podcast and across the Blood Red channel. So be sure to tune in again. But for now, thanks, Matt, very much for joining me. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you again soon.